Dragons, Searanox the Feared. Act 3, Fate of Dragons. Part 1, Betrayal. Searanox was happy, happier than he recently remembered being. He lay sprawled out on a great mound of fresh golden coins. He'd just raided a nice tax caravan, and had carted the whole thing, horse and all, home to his cave. After having killed the horse, and helped himself to a haunch, he pulled the rest of it in and poured everything out of every box and crate. Raw money, the best results to a swooping raid. He burned whatever wasn't valuable, huffing air to scatter the ashes. Flopping down over the cold metal was a great feeling, even though it didn't last long with his high body heat. But that was not currently what was making him happy. Azurea, his mate, was upon her harp. But now the blue dragoness was seated daintily by the instrument, plucking away idly, a pensive look on her face. Sometimes she played when she wanted time to think, or to calm the general mood of the lair. She knew the harp was magical and tended to put Searanox to sleep, but he seemed to be putting up a relatively good fight today. After having returned with an entire cart and emptied it of its contents, he'd flopped down to listen. It had been perhaps a fortnight since the slaying of Axemis and his proposal of matehood to Azurea. They'd spent a good portion of it, well, doing exactly what newly mated couples tended to do. But soon they needed fresh air and food, so life was slowly moving back to normal. He studied Azurea closely while she played, frowning. As his mate, he would take care of, support, and fight for her, amongst other things, but there was a nagging something in the back of his mind that he couldn't quite sink his claws into. Frowning thoughtfully, he stared at her plucking, his brow crushed down into a pained expression as he tried to identify the meaning of the hot prickling in the back of his head. "Stop hurting yourself." Azurea paused in her wordless la-la-las to scold him playfully. Searanox blinked out of his thoughts, lifting his head. "You're thinking too hard. Stop it. You're hurting yourself," she said smoothly, claws plucking in quiet patterns across the strings of the harp. Searanox frowned at her, flapping his wings open in a threatening manner before refolding them again for comfort. She snorted at him, claws still dancing along the instrument. "I am not hurting myself," he said with a muttering growl. "Huh! Come, Searanox, even the mightiest must admit their weaknesses in case there's an arrow in your nose." Azurea's paw suddenly dropped as she pointed at him in shock. Searanox frowned at her, puzzled. Feeling his muzzle, sure enough, there was a serrated arrow sticking out of the brunt and armored scales on his nose. Not enough to give him any pain. He hadn't known it was there. He rose up with his eyes comically crossed. He said with a troubled frown, reaching to pull it out. A new arrow had appeared in his paw, once more not deep enough to register pain. Azurea suddenly whirled towards the cave entrance. "Intruders," she said with a growl, rearing up into a more threatening stance. Searanox turned with a snarl, cursing to himself that he'd not heard them coming. The harp music had lulled him. His jowls lifted, and a third arrow suddenly lodged itself between his teeth. "Ugh," he said, for it was very uncomfortable to have something lodged between one's teeth, even a dragon's. He yanked it roughly out, finally getting a good look at the party in their home, a group of 4 shabby-looking rabbit folk. A knight with a sword and cloak, a hunter with a bow, a robed something of no doubt magical origin, and what appeared to be a muscled wrestler. Searanox gauged each by their garb, stance, and general appearance. He stared at them, and they stared back. Azurea stared too. There was a long silence, followed by Searanox's "Hi." Usually adventuring parties that diversed beyond heavy armor and swords had some spiel they'd like to...
"Searanox the Feared, we've come to slay you in the name of the king, for the innocent rabbit folk of the realm." And for glory!
The knight whipped out his sword with a flourish of ringing metal. Searanox fought back a hatchling's giggle. Just the innocent rabbit folk, my mate, not the bad ones. They can burn. He turned to tell Azurea. The blue dragoness smirked, rolling her eyes. Her mate did love to toy with his prey. She stayed where she was by the harp, her tail curling about it so she could sit upright to watch.
Come forth and fight us, ye beast!
The hunter drew yet another arrow and fired it into Searanox's breast. It stuck there, sure enough, but all it did was make Searanox lift his brow to one side. The hunter looked crestfallen, genuinely crestfallen. It's like they are trying to speak to me. I know it, Searanox reported to Azurea, who snorted. This was entertaining, to say the least. Usually they were just knights on horseback. Something new was refreshing, even if it was as equally pathetic. Well, if you insist. Searanox rose to all fours, pretending to be slow and lazy. He made a show of opening his tail blades where he could see them. The sound of drawing swords was always lovely when they snapped open like that.
Your horde shall be used to recompensate for all the thievery, destruction and chaos you've caused over the years.
The knight sure did like to talk, Searanox noted. But then again, having slain so many would-be dragon slayers, the Great Red gave them their due and let them speak. It was like giving a prisoner his last meal. It was only polite. But it was getting a little old already, and Searanox much preferred Azurea's soothing harp to all this shouting. Turning with a flourish of his tail, the dragon flared his wings open, liquid night. Roaring and shaking the cave with the concussive force of dragon fear, he whipped his bladed tail forward to cleave the knight in two. There was a crash and a spray of sparks, for the knight had raised a thick shield, and had not only not been killed, but had stopped Searanox's tail. Azurea's brow went up. Holy!
No!
Roared the robed figure, turning as his paw suddenly caught flame.
Glomeretur in orban ignis!
Azurea's language lessons caught. Let fire be formed into a ball, or something of the sort. Pfft, as though Searanox could be burned. Crushing a spherical shape together, he suddenly turned towards Azurea and launched it at her like a catapult's bullet. She gave a feral shriek, throwing herself to one side as the harp was blown into 1,000 pieces.
She's not fireproof now like he is.
The now identified as wizard shouted.
Her scales are thinner.
Searanox was more than a little shocked that the rabbit folk in his lair had not died in mere moments. Investing more into the knights before him, he whip-snapped his tail back and forth with a testing sort of effort. Leap, roll, dodge, shield deflection, an honest-to-behemoth seasoned adventuring party. My, he said, with what was no doubt more excitement than Azurea was comfortable with. He tried to kill me, she said, scrambling back onto all fours. Suddenly another fireball whizzed past her head, exploding against the wall and showering her with debris. She gave an honest roar as her wings flared, and then flapped hard, sending a great gust. The wizard held his flat top hat, his rabbit ears flapping in the wind, but he held his ground. The wrestler-looking sort was advancing on Azurea, and the hunter was already drawing an arrow for her. Meanwhile, Searanox danced with the knight.
Your time is nigh, Searanox the Feared,
the knight shouted, grunting as the dragon's tail blade screamed sparks off his shield. Searanox wanted to gag. How many times had he had to listen to this garbage? Growing more than a little annoyed, he chanced to look at Azurea, who was now dodging an honest-to-goodness fireballs. Frowning in anger, he suddenly gave a shriek of pain. Blood seeped from the softer part of his tail, where the knight had gotten a free swing on him. Growling darkly, Searanox reared up like a mountain goat, and crashed his face into the knight himself. He saw red a moment, having flung himself right into the knight's shield, and was kissed by his blade. He gave a short grunt of pain, gritting his teeth. The knight tried for another swing, but the dragon's head was out of reach by then. Azurea fought sideways, using her tail in rapid succession to steer the wrestler away. Hunched like an angry cat, she grunted when an arrow from the hunter pierced her side like a bee sting. "Ouch!" she said, casting the arrow off herself with a flick.
Glomerenturin orban ignis.
Azurea realized too late that standing sideways to use her tail had presented a far larger target for the wizard to fling his fireballs at her. She cried out, tumbling end over end at the force of the spell as it hit her and then exploded. Her wings went this way and that, her side scales blackened but not broken. Shaking her head quickly, she rose with an angry hiss, eyes turning to slits. The wrestler rushed forward with a shout, leaping far higher than she would have given him credit for, landing a crushing fist between Azurea's eyes. She gave a feral shriek, her vision flashing white for a moment as she staggered back. The cry of the wounded mate sent Searanox into overdrive. Click. His fiery breath buried the screaming knight in fire. He watched the rabbit only briefly as he tried to tear his cloak off, rolling around in the golden gems that made the floor. Turning quickly, the great red leapt upon the robed figure he'd seen sending out fireballs. His victim suddenly turned with a mighty flourish, and lightning arced from a wand he'd produced from his sleeve in a mere moment. Searanox seized up in pain and crashed down to the earth, writhing uncontrollably. Click. Azurea's lightning blew apart the leaping wrestler in a fantastic spray of gore and body parts. Her pain made her feral, and now there was no more mercy to be had. These foolish mortals would die, right now. Another arrow clattered into her scales, but did no good. She sighed inwardly. Poor bowman, so useless against the large armored enemies like dragons. He probably felt foolish. Searanox righted himself after a short time of rolling in very real pain. It had been some time since any proper challenge had approached him, but the time for games was over. Roaring with a full breath of air, dragon fear concussed off of his body like a physical force. The mountains shuddered and the dunes of treasure pitched themselves over. Azurea gritted her teeth and dug her claws in, gasping at the raw power. Suddenly the hunter dropped his bow and ran for his life, slipping out through the cave entrance tunnel. They did not chase him. Lightning arced into Searanox once more, and he gave a roar of pain as red scales shattered off of his shoulder, scorched flesh exposed beneath. The wizard's wand was powerful indeed. Azurea motored along the ground like a crazed gecko. The robed rabbit turned with a flourish, pointing his wand at her. A bolt of lightning exploded from the wand, brunting off of Azurea's face. He'd chosen the wrong element to attack a sky dragon with. It blinded her, but the blue dragons were born of the storm and immune to such things. She saw fear in his eyes then, just as she bit him in half with a furious twist. The great red forced himself upright again, panting when suddenly a new pain exploded into his side. Searanox roared in this pain, almost tipped over again. Turning to see the newcomer, he saw the knight had rejoined the fight. His cloak had burned away to reveal armor covered in tiny intricate runes. His sword gave off a ghostly glow, and had ripped right through the scales in Searanox's side, like a knife through cheese. "Dragon's bane," Searanox spat, turning to face him directly and steer him about the room. Azurea stalked behind the knight, hissing in a feral way. Someone had been to the local village recently, it seemed, for he wore the dragon's bane armor upon his stalwart frame, expensive but powerful. Searanox growled angrily, lowering himself like he was about to pounce and flipping his wings open like an angry cobra. Stalking in a slow circle with his mate behind the knight doing the same, he spat a quick fireball. The knight deflected it with a flourish of his shield, still perfectly at the ready.
"I told you I would come to be your end, Searanox,"
he shouted bravely, raising his shining shield.
"and you've breathed fire twice upon my shield."
He turned it sideways, and the silvery grey of the shield suddenly turned to a molten red. The dragon had only a moment to tilt his head before it spewed fire like it were a dragon itself. Searanox's breath, twice over, turned back at him. He gave a feral shriek of surprise, the force alone pushing him back a bit. Azurea took the opportunity, rushing forward to take the knight's head off. She was staved off when he flourished with an enchanted blade, spinning about to warn her away. Searanox stood quickly, his handsome white mane a little dishevelled.
Fire!
He roared, insulted and laughing.
I was born for this.
He inhaled deeply, and Azurea threw herself to one side as his black maw split open. The roar was terrible, and the fires a deep red. The knight raised his shield, and it glowed bright red, but so engulfing was the dragon's fiery breath that the golden treasure around the knight's feet began to melt. He sank as though in a bog, up to his knees, then his waist. The rabbit man roared in agony, stuck where he was. The dragon's breath forced him to the very stone floor, buried under all the melted finery up to his chest.
Oh gods! Oh God, save me!
He cried as he burned alive, liquid metal pressing in on him on all sides. Searanox leapt like a great mountainous death and crushed him with an explosive smashing weight. Dragon's bane armor could deflect draconic strength, yes, but sheer weight? It was just metal then. Searanox staggered out of the melted gold, warning Azurea back with a look of it as he quickly cooled it into a glob of golden nothing. Soaked in his paws with the stuff, he hissed in mild pain as he tried to shake it off like mud. Immunity from the heat could only stretch so far, even for fire dragons. There was silence, save both the dragons panting loudly. They looked around the lair quickly. The hunter was gone, the knight crushed, the wizard was bitten in half, the wrestler blown apart. "Was that all of them?" Azurea asked, a little panicky at this new breed of intruder she'd never seen before. "Did we get them?" she pleaded to Searanox for reassurance. His great head swung one way then the other, no movement. He nodded seriously, and she rushed to his side, pressing her head up under his chin, shuddering. "I've never seen mortal racers do that," she said, exasperated. "Why did you never tell me they might pose a threat?"
"Once in a blue moon, you get a party of them like that who actually know what they're doing."
Searanox frowned at the remains of the knight, but nuzzled his mate regardless. "You're hurt," she said aghast. "They actually hurt you." The dragoness wheeled around to Searanox's side and shoulder. She touched it gingerly, and he hissed a little, inching away some. Oh gods, your scales!" She looked at the patch missing from his shoulder, looking around for the scattered bits of red on the floor around them. The sheer power of the wand had blown a bit off of his armoured hide. "And you?" Searanox started to express his concern for the burnt scales in her side. But she suddenly abandoned him entirely, rushing away to the corner of the hoard room. "My harp! They wrecked my harp! Those bastards!" Azurea's cry shook the cave, and she launched into a string of explosive swearing that made his brow comically rise. He went over to her, extending a great black wing over her shoulder. She looked up at him, distressed. She'd been very attached to it. "A casualty of battle, my mate," he said carefully, putting his chin atop her head for a moment. The dragoness sighed, picking up a bit of metal here and there. "Do you want to go and kill the enchanting shopkeeper? She sold the armor after all." He offered an outlet. "No, she's just a haggard old woman. No harm to her would be justified," Azurea sighed, scooping up bits of charred silver here and there. She'd never be able to reassemble it, for it had been blown into countless pieces. "I wish there was something we could do about it. Have you any more harps by chance?"
"None that are dragon-sized."
Searanox mused, gripping her shoulder with his claws. There was a long silence of him looking at his sad-faced mate, until it suddenly hit him. "But perhaps we can get it repaired." He smiled broadly. "Searanox, it's in a million pieces. Not even the tiny hands of the rabbit folk could put it back," Azurea said, frowning up at him. He shook his head at her.
"Not rabbit folk, Azurea."
The Great Red stepped away from her, over to a dune of gold. Pawing through it idly, he produced a small chest and popped it open. A familiar large, black and jewelled coin came into view.
"The architect. She will remake it for you."
The Great Red smiled as her face slowly lit up.
"She can do just about anything. Putting bits of metal and string into a certain shape will be no problem for her at all."
"That's a very good idea," she said thoughtfully. "Let's go." She was a little sore in her side from the fireball she'd received, but neither dragon was going to be flying anywhere, so it wouldn't be too bad to go right then. Perhaps they could relax for the evening and recount the glorious battle while she played her harp. She liked the idea. Rising and being very tender with one of her wings, she stood shoulder to shoulder with Searanox. She nodded once and tossed the coin. "Tecton," Azurea barked out authoritatively. A golden portal ripped itself open before them as the coin burst into sparks. It swirled with a welcoming golden light within. Searanox smiled lopsidedly. Stepping through, Azurea followed. The world beyond was a strange thing, to say the least, metallic and yellow as far as the eye could see. Even the filigree thin blades of grass were golden. A whole world of metal. I cannot imagine living here. Azurea shook her head. "Must get lonely." On all fours, the two of them started towards a brief path. Before them was the 7-layered pyramid temple of the architect, demigod-like, being of unfathomable power. Though her magic seemed infinite, she seemed perfectly content to play merchant with Searanox, and who knew else? One would think that, having such powers, things like money would have no real value anymore. But everyone had their weaknesses, the dragoness supposed. As they came to the foot of the building, both dragons frowned. No one was upon the architect's throne. "Hello?" Azurea said, surprised. She looked at Searanox. "Is she sleeping, you think?"
"It is midday, and I doubt it. I've never seen the architect unavailable."
Searanox was weary, looking around a little anxiously.
"Something is amiss."
The two of them wandered about a little, walking alongside the pyramid and looking around. The daze was quite empty, and everything was very clean and shiny. The Great Red peered about, skyward and all around. "Nothing," he said, cocking his head in confusion. "Maybe she's on vacation?" Azurea tried again. Both dragons doubted that. "Or, another customer. Surely you're not the only one who caters to her?" She rubbed at her sore side and wing, a little nervous at the vast emptiness of the dwelling. There didn't seem to be any way in, but
The only one that matters.
It was many dark voices, but mostly female. Both dragons gave a start and whirled about. The architect stood before them, her slender figure armoured as usual to show neither hair nor hide.
Welcome,
she said, standing stock still as she spoke. Searanox took a moment to gather himself up again.
"Forgive our snooping."
He actually apologized, so rattled was the mighty Red. "We've come to buy something?" It came out like a question. The architect levitated, slowly, from the ground until she was at eye level with Searanox.
Speak,
she said shortly, her arms folding in a slow and formal manner. Azurea was suddenly struck with a feeling of dread. The golden magical aura that was the architect no longer brought her to her knees, but it was certainly a heavy force that made her shudder.
What do you require, Searanox?
Well, the Great Red gestured to Azurea. We had a bit of a battle in the lair. We need a magical item repaired. A dragon's harp.
No.
No? Searanox blinked in surprise. No what?
No, I will not repair your item.
Why not?
He said, frowning angrily. Azurea folded her aching wing a bit harder, taking a step back. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. I'm quite finished selling you toys and catering to your silly whims. Searanox the Red Flame. The architect invoked Searanox's old title, levitating slowly to the ground again. An icy feeling poured over both dragons, and Azurea backed up a bit more towards the exit portal.
How do you know my old name?
Searanox rose from his regal posture to a four-legged one of caution. Little red flags were rising in the back of his head, but he did not know why.
I know everything about you.
It was many voices, many very angry voices. The architect raised her hand, and it was outlined in a shimmering aura. The ground beneath Azurea rumbled a bit, and the bricks fell out from under her. Suddenly a second portal opened beneath Azurea, and she fell through with a cry. Searanox! Her voice faded quickly with distance, gods knowing where she'd gone.
Azurea!
Searanox whirled about and threw himself upon the portal just as it snapped closed with a crack of thunder. He face-planted hard, blood spouting from his muzzle. Hot and angry, the dragon turned.
You've betrayed me,
he accused, tail blades springing free and the sound of drawing swords.
Tell me where you've sent her, I'll take your head off right here.
His inner kiln clicked on and he poised himself for battle. The nearest castle fortress to your lair. The architect's green eyes flashed with boundless magics.
I saw her nursing her wing.
I doubt she'll make a very safe landing. Was that amusement in her tone? The architect had always been a neutral force in front of Searanox. Now she taunted him so openly. Losing his boiling temper, he roared flame and melted the very golden path they stood upon. When his lungs had all but collapsed, Searanox stepped back, panting. A magical rushing wind hushed the flames into nothing. At the epicenter of a cone-shaped melted swath stood the architect, unharmed and encased in a sphere of golden light.
Gold is a soft metal, Searanox. I, however, am not.
The Great Red swore explosively, his tail dancing about as he waited for his opportunity to strike the architect down. Then came the presence, the great crushing presence that Azurea had known. Searanox groaned, coiling his muscles as not to be pressed into the ground he stood upon.
I do not expect you to understand, but I'd rather you suffered more before I killed you outright.
The Great Red's claws were leaving lines in the bricks, sending gold shavings every which way as he was pressed bodily backward. The architect held up a hand, an invisible wall of force herding Searanox backward towards the exit. He gritted his teeth, not wanting to give in. Surely the difference of power was not that great between them.
I'll return soon. There is no way you can hide from me. Go and warn your mate, Searanox.
The architect's eyes flickered with a hot stain of evil as she punctuated.
Again.
Searanox's blood went icy and his mouth went agape. The pressing force suddenly redoubled and pitched him into the air. He passed through the portal and tumbled out of the other side into a dune of gold and gems. The architect stood just inside the portal, a black shadow with sparkling green eyes on a background of bright gold. The fiery red stood, wavering and stunned as his weight shifted back and forth on its own. Shaking his head back and forth to reorient himself, he stared at the architect. Coiling his back legs, he sprung at her with an insane roar. The portal snapped close with a roar of thunder, and he almost hit the wall behind it. Skidding over mounds of gems, Searanox fled his wings and tore out of the lair. Pitching himself out into the ashy veil, he spread his wings and launched skyward with all his might. His great cry echoed across the valley.
Azurea!
Act 3, Part 2. Fortress. Azurea was screeching, flapping, falling out of control. Her wounded wing inside would not obey as she pitched straight down from on high. As soon as she passed through the inky darkness of the clouds, she was plunged into a violent rainstorm. Thunder exploded, shuddering her entire body as lightning struck in the distance. Shouting, swearing, and trying to right herself, she spied the bright portal she'd fallen through close with another roll of thunder. Tumbling end over end, she squeezed her eyes shut and tried to focus. Her wings came open like a glider, and she roared in pain as the muscles overexerted with her weight against the wind. Concentration shattered, she held herself with both paws and looked below. There was some sort of structure rushing up to meet her, grey like stone, and hosting lots of little buildings inside with straw-thatched roofs. A fortress? A castle? It was hard to tell from directly above. The Sky Dragoness knew that a sheer landing would kill her, and fought to adjust herself and control it. Wings were not working. The pain in her side was preventing any maneuvering. What else was there to be done? Pointing her nose towards the ground and folding her wings, she gathered what concentration she could right as she began to pass tips of the highest towers. A stable rushed up to meet her. Click. Lightning exploded from her maw, blinding and deafening her at the same time. The close proximity of the large target gave a vicious recoil, and her head snapped back as she rode the explosion. She screeched as she blasted down upon the ground, through the barn and leveling some of the building with her. Bones broke and she screamed, wings flailing about. The rush of dust and debris was muted by the rain, but the sudden blast of lightning and the screaming had not fallen on deaf ears. There were rabbit folk running along the paths towards her, but she did not see or hear them. She was too stunned, in too much pain to move. Gasping, chest heaving, and gagging, she squirmed until she could lay on her back. She gave a voracious cry when her back right leg bent at the wrong angle, and she thrashed in agony. Crying out into the vicious storm, she saw a great number of armored shadows fall upon her. Clutching at her broken limb, she scuttled away to make herself a smaller target, but was only jabbed in the side by a fallen rubble. Groaning, she fell and panted, making sure all her teeth were out on display. Badly wounded, but not toothless.
"A dragon!"
One of them pointed out dumbly while a growing group of them gathered about the broken building to view her.
"It fell right out of the sky,"
someone said.
"I saw it right before it hit. Doesn't it have wings? Did it crash?"
Azurea slumped a bit, just trying to breathe and grit her teeth through the incredible pain of a broken leg and more. Hissing dangerously, she snarled and bore her teeth at them.
"What should we do with it?"
They were talking awfully loudly, looking back and forth between themselves.
"It's injured. Let's kill it. One less dragon to harass the region."
There was a roar of approval and a drawing of many weapons. Azurea winced. She couldn't move much, nor create cyclones with only one good wing. Drawing herself up with a louder growl, she hissed like an angry snake and tried to make ready her lightning breath. No response. It took time to recharge, and a lot of effort to use to begin with. In her sorry state, she could do little but bite.
"Coming to get me is a mistake, and it will be your last, little rabbit folk,"
she hissed at them, tossing her head back to give her best roar. It was a strangled sound for her injuries. The gathered rabbit folk bristled, and more weapons came into view, crossbows and longbows. They were not so stupid as to get into range of her teeth. Well, except one. Losing his head entirely, one of the younger soldiers rushed forward with a shout, blade raised. Azurea's tail whiplashed without a warning, striking him down and sending him careening back into his friends. She hissed again, backing up against what remained of a wall. She turned to look. It was well supported. "I'm warning you," she hissed again, trying not to test her broken leg.
What are we waiting for? Draw arrows!
At least a dozen bows were raised to Azurea. Some eyes closed to take aim. Azurea cried out as she was pelted with what felt like bee stings to her. Roaring in pain and anger, she lashed out with her tail, taking out a support beam of a stable. The group scrambled back as debris rained down from one side of the building.
We're not hurting it, just pissing it off.
One of them shouted.
Try again!
Azurea had quite enough of all of this. Snarling savagely, she seized a support beam that had fallen and tossed it with all her might. Even the strength of half a dozen rabbit folk was not enough to keep it from bowling over the group. Reaching again, the blue dragoness took anything else she could pick up and throw. She tossed heavy rocks, more wood, anything large that wasn't nailed down. The rabbit folk scattered and she lay there, panting, growling and daring any brave soul to come back and harass her once more. Peering out into the storm, Azurea saw that the fortress portcullis was up, and the gates partway open. Perhaps if she could just drag herself out, she could find a river and drift to safety. She gritted her teeth, moaning loudly in agony as she pulled herself into motion. Hissing and spitting, she lifted her broken leg up and hobbled on 3 legs. Screeching in pain, she saw them watching her. "Out of my way!" she roared threateningly. They made a loose circle around her, weapons at the ready as though she might strike out at any time. None of them seemed to know what to do with her. She flashed her tail back and forth as best she could, the whip-like snap of the tip warning them back. Struggling across the cobblestone, she began a miserable lope towards the exit.
Don't let it escape!
1 or 2 of the soldiers rushed forth with swords drawn. Azurea battered them aside with her tail, desperate and strength waning. Panting, she fought to keep her vision from sliding out of focus. She was in a lot of pain, very tired. The outline of a horse and cart was silhouetted in the darkness under the archway at the exit. The horse nickered nervously, catching the scent of dragon. The driver stood from his seat, mouth agape. Azurea's front legs were slowly giving out. She heard that much. Her vision went sideways as exhaustion and pain forced her down into a red inky blackness. "Searanox," she whimpered as her eyes rolled into her head. Searanox flapped his wings hard. There would be no gliding or riding the thermals. This was sheer speed and power. Although the Great Red could not compete with a sky dragon for flight, he had the raw muscle to really move when the time called for it. Taking to the skies with a roar, angry panic, he listed landmarks in his head until the proper one came. A fortress, perhaps 20 minutes' flight away in a straight line. Looking ahead, he saw he was flying into heavy rain. He did not care. Flapping hard, he gritted his teeth and lowered his brow to keep the water from his eyes. Rain spat at him as he rushed forth across the land.
Go and mourn your mate, Searanox. Again.
The architect had betrayed him. He could not imagine a more dangerous enemy. For the first time in several decades, the Great Red was afraid. For himself, and now for Azurea. So deliberate was it, dropping her through a portal and onto a rabbit folk fortress, as though she revelled in repeating history to make him all the more miserable. He had no doubt that the architect could have simply killed them both with some sort of catastrophic magic, right where they stood.
I do not expect you to understand, but I want you to suffer more before I kill you outright.
Searanox flared his wings hard, arching it with a gust of wind. Rain pounded upon him and chilled him, his wings violently flinging droplets with each flap. Pulling his legs up for lesser wing resistance, he aligned his body to hopefully go just a little faster. Something was wrong. Something had changed. Searanox growled, in a rage over the sudden backstabbing. He had been nothing but a good customer, even respectful of the strange golden being. Why now? Why right when he had recollected himself, received his heart back, and attained a mate had she chosen to strike. He gritted his fangs, steaming pants issuing from his maw as he powered through the rain. He had found the original summoning coin of the architect in the hoard of the central house of gold, the final golden dragon family he'd encountered. Was she somehow affiliated with them? He had no answers, and his panic was not helping. Finally he saw the massive structure on the horizon, the rabbit folk fortress of that particular region. Flapping hard and roaring his presence to any for miles around, Searanox swooped high over the place to get a good look. His eyes locked instantly on a blue mass laying sprawled over the cobblestone. Folding his wings, he dove from high like a falcon dropping upon a mouse. Flaring his wings hard so he didn't shatter his ankles, he landed hard and roared with a great fire arc. He saw the arrows sticking out of Azurea's side, and the awful angles of her wings. She was bleeding in places, washed halfway by the rain. Her eyes were rolled into her head, the lids only half closed. Something deep within Searanox snapped.
Foolish rabbits! You've doomed yourselves and every single one of your kin for 100 leagues, 1,000 leagues.
His voice was like a crack of thunder, an ungodly sentence of doom.
You will all fear me.
Dragon fear exploded from his body as passionate, invisible force. The rain rushed away from him like a bubble of pressurized air before it started falling again. The entire fortress shook on its foundations. Rabbit folk soldiers fled in fear into whatever structures they could find, some losing their heads entirely and fleeing out the gates into the woods beyond. Only a few remained, frozen in place. Searanox's tail blades sprung open like the drawing swords, and he raised himself high to mow them in a single swing.
Stop it!
A great, high-pitched screaming sound split Searanox's ears. He actually hesitated. The voice had carried on the wind over the rainstorm and thunder. He'd heard it over the screaming, fleeing rabbit folk soldiers, and even over the hum of his dragon fear. The scene froze for several long seconds, as though the voice itself had stunned the Great Red. He whirled about, for the voice had come from near Azurea's body. There was a rabbit folk child, her arms wrapped around Azurea's muzzle, looking up at him with a terrified and angry expression.
You...
Searanox's molten eyes fixed upon her, his tail still poised to destroy anything within its reach. The child looked up at him, panting feverishly with dragon fear. Just then, 2 more children joined her, pulling back their rain hoods.
He's going to eat us! We gotta go!
One of the boys whispered intensely, pulling on the girl's shoulder. She refused to move, with a growl of stubbornness, still clinging to Azurea's face.
I can feel her breathing! Azurea of the blue sky is breathing!
She called up to the great red monster. He seemed unsure for a split second. The soldiers that remained looked dumbfounded. 3 children stayed the wrath of Searanox the Feared? Madness. The children from the waterfall. Searanox was slowly coming down from his killing edge. His apocalyptic high eased just a hair. The foolish children, he said a bit more softly. He looked around briefly, seeing a horse and cart at the portcullis. The barrels within told of a cheap ale, and the driver of the breeding age read Parent. The Great Red saw him frozen with fear, clutching the reins and standing on his seat. The child must have leapt right out of the cart, and left him there. Strange that dragon fear did not seem to affect the little ones nearly as much as the adults. Perhaps their ignorance, or their innocence.
She might catch cold out here in the rain.
The little rabbit girl shouted up at him over the rain. Searanox looked down at her dumbly, then around the courtyard again. There were soldiers peeking out from windows, from behind barricades, and even from arrow slits, all of them watching the exchange.
Are you listening?
The little one shrieked up at him over the thunder.
You should move her somewhere safe, right? Right? Azurea of the blue sky is alive!
Searanox suddenly snapped back to reality, falling to all fours as his tail blades closed most of the way. Leaning over his mate, he nosed the rabbit folk child rudely out of the way. "Azurea?" he whispered. She did not stir. He placed a paw gingerly upon her side, perhaps to feel her breathing. Instead, he got an agonized moaning sound, and he let go immediately. She lives," he whispered, clenching his teeth to fight the raw emotion his blasted heart was trying to overtake him with.
She's getting wet. You should move her.
The little girl shouted up at him again.
This rain could go on forever.
She flapped her little arms out wide with enthusiasm. She turned towards the soldiers, then towards anyone else present.
We need shelter. Azurea of the blue sky protects us. We need shelter.
It became a shrieking cry as they looked at each other in confusion.
Will no one help us?
She came and, heart-wrenchingly, put her arms about Azurea's head once more and kissed her face. None of the soldiers moved, pinned in place by the dragon fear. Searanox looked about for any sort of overhang, makeshift cave, or... he spotted an open-air smithy, steaming because of the rainfall. It had a high thatched roof because of the forge, and was completely open on all sides. No doubt it supplied the fortress with weapons and repairs. There was plenty of room for, well, about half of Azurea under there. Using his bare paws, Searanox shoved everything out from under the canopy, spilling hot coals out onto the cobble. Cleaning the place out entirely, he gritted his teeth and moved Azurea as slowly as he could. He could not roll her, so he dragged her by her front legs. Her head, shoulders, and even most of her back were finally in shelter. The Great Red looked out upon the courtyard and the other little buildings. They were all staring at him, and the little girl and her two companions. He snarled and they all hid again, although their great ears were easy to spot here and there. The three children made themselves known under the canopy that protected Azurea, and finally an older rabbit arrived, with his hat in his paws. Stuttering, he introduced himself.
I'm Matthias. These are my children. Diana, Carlos, and William.
Searanox had names for the little ones at last, and nodded gravely.
You're Searanox the Feared.
He knew it was so, and bowed his head with some respect, quivering like the lesser creature he was. Your daughter will have a greater destiny than you can fathom, Matthias, Searanox said in his deepest syrupy voice, leaning down and inspecting Azurea for hidden wounds. He began to slowly pluck the arrows from her side. She bled, but not much. Her scales had stopped the arrows at the head.
How do you say?
Matthias gathered his courage to ask. The three children came forth to snatch away the bloody arrows, and any other debris that was in the way. Because a fortress full of soldiers could do naught to stop me from slaughtering everyone inside. But her shrill cries did, Searanox told him. News will travel fast, no doubt, if I know anything of your people. Frowning miserably at Azurea's broken leg, he moved just a little bit before it wrenched another great cry from the dragoness.
That looks a little broken,
Matthias said none too helpfully. Searanox gave him a molten glare and he shuddered, staring at the ground and crushing his hat back and forth in his paws. The little girl, now called Diana, stepped forth with her brothers, running the long way around Azurea. They were setting her wings up against her sides. Once they'd figured out how they folded. They folded them nicely so they took up less room, and Searanox had a bit of a better view.
He finally got a close look at the blackened scales on Azurea's side, from when she had been struck with the fireball. Not too bad. The heat and explosion had merely coloured her lovely blue scales black. She'd have bruising, no doubt, but it could have been far worse.
Searanox the Feared?
Diana called timidly to him, drawing his gaze.
Can we do anything? Anything at all?
Searanox stared at her for a long time, unsure but not letting it show on his face. The rain died down a bit, and he glanced at the sky. "Go and tell those soldiers to keep the peace in this place," he commanded. Diana threw up a child's most serious salute, turned on her heel and dashed off to give the orders. Her little brothers went with him. Suddenly, Matthias saw exactly what Searanox meant. There could be no peace between dragon and rabbit folk, but perhaps between the child and a dragon. Whatever the reason may have been, fretting with his long ears, he placed his hat on his head and slowly sat on his legs. His sons did the same, unsure what to do since their older sister had suddenly taken over a fortress full of soldiers, giving orders on behalf of Searanox the Feared. It was going to be a long night. The architect sat upon her throne, panting softly. So much magic, and so little time. After having sent Searanox on his way, she'd collapsed back into her seat at the first opportunity. Her breathing was coarse, inwards a whine and outwards a gargling growl. Her time was running out, and she knew it. She looked over at the pile of gold nearby Searanox's payment for the supplies of magic armbands he and his mate used. She reached out for it, weakened for the moment, trying to melt it with her magic. Groaning with slight effort, she finally gave up and slumped into her throne once more, most unbecoming. A few minutes after catching her breath, she rose.
Even as Searanox grows stronger, and back to the way he was, I grow weaker.
She said it to no one at all, as she walked to the pile. We shall no doubt intersect soon. Her forceful aura began to melt the pile of coins and trinkets into a globby blob of nothing, but only by proximity. Falling unceremoniously to her knees, the architect looked up when she sensed a presence. Some distance away, a great golden dragon sat across from her, translucent like a spirit. Godlike and devilishly handsome, he smiled only lightly at her. He was handsome and divine as all golds were, his eyes liquid sunlight. Coiled up like a massive snake with his long body, he seemed to be looking upon her with a calculating gaze.
I know,
the architect said to him,
but things are in motion now. It will not be long.
When Searanox falls, you may rest at last. He continued to stare at her, his long whiskers floating with a breeze that wasn't there. The great mane wriggled about in the air as though he was laying under water.
We are very close. Just a little more time.
There was a concussive wind that made the architect cling to the ground on all fours. "Avenge me," the wind whispered. The architect panted once, looking down open at the blobby mess in front of her. The great golden ghost across from her looked tersely upset, sitting regally upon his coiled self. "Avenge me." It was a bit louder and more insistent. While she waited for her sustenance to reach the right consistency, a chip of her armor suddenly fell from her shoulder. She snatched it off the ground and tossed it into the melting pile. She looked embarrassedly at the spirit, as though pleading forgiveness. The upright and regal architect was coming apart at the seams. So little time left. Suddenly her helm's faceplate split open in a great jagged mouth of blackness, and she dove upon the melted gold like a ravenous beast. Her frame was like a great stained glass window suddenly illuminated by the bizarre and carnal act. The filigree grass tilted away from her as the mild waves of raw magic slowly built themselves back up again. The liquid metal dribbled down the sides of her massive fangs,
as she gorged herself. The hiss of metal greeted the darkness within, and she was warmed. Some time later, when she was done, she stayed upon the ground. Looking at her shoulder where the armor was broken off, she watched it slowly shift until it was reformed, just as bright and shining as before. Panting and reaching into the deep well of magics within, she closed the faceplate of her helm with sheer willpower. The jagged metal teeth vanished, and they melted back together into the panel they once were. The nicks and dings she'd suffered in her staggering melted away to perfection. Standing slowly with a great heaving sigh, the architect's eyes flashed a brilliant green.
Much better,
she whispered to no one, for the image of the golden dragon had vanished. Turning on her heel, she made her way back to the throne to push her machinations into motion. It was almost time to make Searanox suffer once more. Azurea woke to a dull ache of pain, and a miserably bad taste in her mouth. She could hear Searanox's voice, and it quickly slid into focus as her ears twitched a little.
And if I get the slightest inkling you are giving her something bad, I will kill you, hunt your family, kill your livestock, burn your home, shit on your crops.
The dragoness moaned vocally, just then to end the long list of threats. Something green and lumpy slid into her mouth, and she smacked her lips a bit. Someone had, or was, trying to feed her something in her sleep. Medicine, perhaps? It would have taken a massive portion to suit a dragon.
Azurea?
Searanox's voice was much closer, and as her vision returned to her, she saw his face. Azurea, he said again, leaning over her. Searanox. Ah! She gave a painful start when a rabbit-folk child's face popped into her view, far too close to her eyeball for comfort. She felt the little furry hand stroking her face and cheek.
Azurea!
She accentuated with enthusiasm.
You're awake! Finally! My brothers and Da and I didn't sleep all night. We watched over you and...
She paused for a massive yawn, and Searanox shoved her aside with enough force to make her yelp. Azurea heaved a great sigh, lifting her head just a little. It pounded, and breathing deeply hurt. Moving her wing hurt. Moving anything else hurt. Gasping a little with a sharp, hot pain, she looked at the back leg. A wooden beam, no doubt from a building, had been tied to it like a massive wooden splint. "How long have I been out?" she said.
"All of the afternoon, and the following night,"
Searanox said, nodding to the apothecary who was gathering up his herbs and ingredients nearby. Perhaps what he'd given Azurea would help ease the pain, as promised. Whatever it was, it hit her stomach hard and she winced.
"It's the morning of the next day,"
he said to her, leaning and very gingerly nuzzling her mane. The gesture was touching to behold, and some of the soldiers would later tell of that moment in their yarn-spinning tales. Azurea gurgled a sort of happy sound, closing her eyes for a bit. Then her eyes snapped open again. "Where are we?" she said with some urgency, risking pain to turn her head. "Dear gods!" She gaped at all the staring faces, and then the grey stone walls, and then the rest of the scene. "Is this a fortress?" she gasped, lifting her head up despite the pounding of it. She looked about, and everything started coming back to her, falling from the sky. How embarrassing for a sky dragon like herself. Her ears tucked a bit.
"Yes, we are safe for the moment, remember? The rabbit folk like Azurea of the blue sky."
Searanox chuckled a little.
Azurea?
Matthias had come forward, braver than before.
My daughter has told me much about you, as have my sons.
He bowed low. Azurea gave him a calculating look before making a slow nod. She looked over at the 3 children, also present, until he spoke again.
I know there is little we can do to help you, but I did want to step forward to say thank you when the chance came,"
he said, looking at her claws instead of her face. He played with his foppish little hat, red-faced. "For what?" Azurea said, confused.
"For everything.
He blurted a little.
Since you've come, greater peace has come to this region.
Matthias confided in her.
Fewer dragon attacks, despite there being 2 of you now, and less wanton thievery and violence in the roads because people fear the Tempest."
The Tempest? Azurea wrinkled her nose a bit, and Searanox leaned a little to hear the small creature more clearly.
"Some are starting to call you Tempest, Azurea, for you watch over this region with all the fury of the storms."
Matthias related to her the story of when Searanox had tried to destroy the nearby town with his breath. Azurea had conjured a cyclone of water from the nearby river to save them. Then he lamented of how the Sky Dragoness was often seen looking down the cliff tops like a mighty guardian, and how some rabbit folk were trying to use her as some indication of coming rainstorms. Azurea felt a certain heat in her cheeks, while he went on about odd events in the past months that the rabbit folk thought connected with her, weather-affecting magics. Some was true, most of it not. She raised a paw slightly to stop him. "Thank you, Matthias." Some of the soldiers posted at a cautious distance in their own fortress were murmuring amongst themselves. They had heard stories of Azurea of the Blue Sky, whispered in rumour. Was this truly her, fallen out of the sky upon them? The aura of tension quickly shifted to that of embarrassment.
"Open the gates, all the way. Raise the portcullis the rest of the way."
Someone of rank finally found voice when Azurea began to struggle to her feet. Searanox supported as best he could, but little could be done for her back leg. The Great Red had never beheld such a marvel. Rabbit folk were not only not brainless, but letting them leave with no fight. He peered about to get a good look at their faces. Their strange, floppy ears still amused him, as did the holes in their breeches to show their cotton ball tails. But it was strange for him to get a good long look at them without a sword being pointed at him, or some ridiculous heroic speech yelled out into his face. These rabbit folk were not so bad as the others. He made a show of closing his tail blades all the way, as they made their way towards the exit. The rabbit folk soldiers stared at the 2 dragons as they limped out of the fortress. They all got a good look at both magnificent creatures. They did not seem so bad when they weren't kidnapping maidens, snatching farm animals, or eating virgins. There was a long, uneasy silence that would have betrayed even the snapping of twigs as the dragons exited onto the portcullis archway and outside the fortress. Searanox looked back at the fortress with a visibly relieved expression as soon as both of their tails had cleared the archway. Even then he would not have put it past the rabbit folk to drop their spike gate upon them at that last moment. But the uneasy truth inspired by Azurea's deeds had lasted until they were free. Searanox saw Matthias and his 3 children standing in the archway. Peered over the battlements at them were a host of soldiers. No one spoke, though the children waved furiously at both dragons. Searanox let out a great breath of relief once they passed beyond the tree line to head back to the mountain lair. It would take the entire day to reach their home, Searanox occasionally carrying Azurea on his back. When they at last found the cool touch of the gold of the hoard upon their paws, they collapsed in exhaustion. The Great Red wanted to chew the wooden splint off of Azurea's leg, but she would not let him. She would need time to heal, maybe weeks. With the architect bearing down upon them, it was certainly not a good time to have such a broken leg. Act 3, Part 3. Ashes. Searanox fussed over his mate until she nipped at him rudely, unable to stand it any more. "I've broken a leg, Searanox. I'm not dying." She snapped her teeth at him and he backed off a bit. He dug her a nest in the mounds of golden gems the night before, then laid on her to keep her warm. Then he helped her outside to answer nature's call the next morning, fed her, and so on and so forth. The dragoness was starting to feel embarrassed. She did not like being so helpless. The great red backed off a bit, lowering his head and wings to look pathetic at her. Azurea chuckled a little, shaking her head. "No, that will not work on me, you great oaf. Let me be for a bit, She wanted some time to rest and be by her lonesome. "If you need me, just ask," Searanox said as she limped down the hall to her sanctuary room. She passed none too gracefully through the magical barrier, pulling the curtain so she could rest and croon over her leg. This left the great red all alone. He looked about nervously, as though the architect might suddenly spring from any pile of gold he owned. He busied himself for several hours, well into the afternoon, rearranging this pile of treasure with that one, displaying an ornamental sword instead of a scepter, and many other little things. A dragon's hoard made a statement about him after all. It needed to be kept with some semblance of tidiness. The great red uncovered his journal when moving a mound of gold from one place to another. He frowned at it, sweeping a few coins off it. Pawing briefly through the massive leather pages, he snapped it closed. Such bad memories. Sighing a bit when he had the hoard room just so, he went back to it and flipped it open once more. Searanox's past unfolded before him, falling in love with their story, her death, the slaughtering of the 5 houses of gold, the architect, attempting a story's resurrection, then finally becoming heartless. That was where the entry stopped. Suddenly the great red frowned, flipping backward a few pages. He had met the architect after Astori's death, after his beloved had been literally bound and dropped into a castle among the rabbit folk. How had the architect known to torment him with such a similar event with Azurea? He frowned deeply. Something did not add up. Once more it crossed his mind that perhaps the architect was affiliated with the Golden Dragon families. But how? She was no dragon. She did not give off dragon fear in the use of her powers. Was she something similar, or just something else entirely? Perhaps one of the Golds had struck a bargain with her, that he should be tormented if he ever found another mate. There was so much he did not know, and it frustrated him. Poring over the tome for many hours, thankful Azurea was resting, he soon found himself laying his head down and dozing. Lying still in golden bedding was a sure way to cause sleepiness in a dragon like himself. He stared vacantly ahead, curling his tail about himself and resting his chin on his closed tail blades. Just as Searanox's eyes were falling closed, he heard a strange sound. Snuffing back into a full awareness, he caught the glimmer of gold in one of the tunnels ahead of him. Standing quickly, he leaned forward with curiosity. "Who's that? I saw you," he growled, his tail blade springing open aggressively. Astori emerged into the hoard room, coming in from the outside world. Searanox smiled suddenly, happy to see her. "What?" she said. "I will live here soon too, you know." Though she was a long and snake-like dragon with small limbs, she was so graceful that she could glide along the ground as though it were water. He liked that about her. She came up to him, rearing up like a cobra and touching the end of her muzzle to his cheek. He chuckled a little. Her long whiskers often tickled him. "Searanox," she said with some affection, a certain softness in her eyes. His chest inflated into a more masculine, impressive posture, and he sat on his haunches. She giggled at him, nuzzling up and down on his cheek, until he gurgled with laughter deep in his throat. Her long body did slow circuits around him until she'd done 2 laps, laying on herself like a coiled snake. Searanox set his chin on part of her, smiling innocently,
knowing full well he was weighing her down. She gently rammed his shoulder with her dainty horns, snickering and making him move some. "You're heavy," Estori said. The great red lifted his head and extended his wings out to hide her from the world. She pressed her head up under his chin, happy and affectionate. "Estori," he gurgled softly, his eyes half open with a pleased, drowsy expression. They spent some time just laying there together, murmuring little things back and forth like resting lovers. The golden dragoness coiled around him tightly, sharing in the fiery heat of Searanox's body. "Will you show me more of the lair this day?" she asked, looking at him with a soft expression he could hardly resist. "You promised to show me. I know you said you'd be carving out sub-caverns and such to keep more things in." Searanox nodded as she slowly uncoiled from him. Rising lazily and with his tail dragging the ground in a love-drunk way, he gestured with a nod towards the proper tunnel. "Exciting!" Estori said, smiling with all her brilliance. The great red looked lovingly into her green sparkling eyes and chuckled deep in his chest. "Come, I will show you what I've done so far," Searanox said, starting forward. While Searanox started forward, quite lost in his own fantasy, the architect followed silently behind. With her hand raised slightly, outlined in the golden light, she made her puppet dance. Estori rubbed up against Searanox, squawking with laughter when he nipped at her horns with some force. Masking her presence with severe concentration, she walked behind the pair of them. A dozing dragon was easy to fool, indeed. Especially those who are not as bright, like Searanox. Searanox led the way down into the tunnels, frowning a bit. I don't remember carving this much," he said mildly, tilting his head at the honeycombing pathways. "Perhaps I hit an air pocket somewhere and do not remember." He shrugged a bit. "Though I did manage to make a special cavern just for you, Estori," he told her. She smiled, looking enchanted. "When we have established our territory, this shall be our home, and you will have this portion all to yourself." "I get my own room?" Estori bubbled, giggling and wiggling back and forth as she went. This made her body do a peculiar, beautiful waving motion. Searanox smiled and nodded. "Is it big? Is it hidden? Or will I be out in the open?" "It is hidden, just like you asked," Searanox said. "If your family ever came to tear us apart, you could hide here and there, and they would never know of your presence." His plan was clever, and he knew it. 3 feet of solid stone as a hidden door, a ventilation shaft, and I've set aside food and water as well. It is perfect for emergencies. Even if half of your silly kin came sniffing, they would never find you. The architect's eyes narrowed, a new piece of the story coming to light. She wiggled her fingers a bit, prompting the puppet. "Thank you so much, my love." She reared back up like a cobra, running her forked tongue over his cheek with affection. He snickered bemusedly, and they turned the corner. Searanox lowered his head, for the ceiling was getting a bit more cramped. "I would do anything for you, Estori," Searanox said dreamily, nodding towards the relatively blank wall ahead. It was covered with scratch marks, as though that was where he'd stopped digging. Estori tilted her head a bit, frowning with curiosity. The great red leaned into her view, then looked forward. "Estori," he told the wall somewhat officially. In the bottom left corner, a scuffed little Ouroboros symbol glowed brightly. Cracks started to work their way up the wall until it parted like 2 great double doors to a room beyond. The room was well lit, golden and clean. Weapons lined the walls, and a portrait of Estori herself was on the far wall. A dais with an altar upon it hosted a great glass urn filled with golden ashes that sparkled in the light. Searanox gave a start, frowning. "What is this?" the Great Red said, stepping inside and looking around curiously. "Where did this painting come from? These weapons? What's in here?" He popped the top off the urn, his nostrils expanding a little aggressively. He sneezed. It was ash. Very old ash, but it was flecked with bright gold. I don't understand." He looked back at his mate, very confused. Estiori had her head down and was giggling silently, for her mane was shuddering with the racking motion of her body. Then her voice finally joined into a tinkling, enthusiastic sound of joy. "Why, Searanox, it's lovely," she said between giggles as he stared at her with a furrowed brow. He'd not made this strange room. She looked up at him, a great bleeding line having appeared on her cheek. The bits of golden blood spattered the floor audibly. What happened to you?" Searanox fell silent, and ice worked his veins as another slash appeared on her neck, blossoming with thick blood. "What's happening to you?" he roared, taking a step back and bumping the altar. The urn teetered dangerously. More and more cuts and great slashing marks appeared up and down Estiori's body while she stood there laughing at him. Searanox felt himself growing ill, confused and horrified by what he saw. It was as though 100 blades were sticking her from all sides, hacking bits of flesh from her beautiful golden body. The architect's eyes glittered with amusement. She made a mild gesture, and her puppet collapsed onto her belly, blood pooling about her as scales molted off of her into little piles and burst into brilliant sparkles of ash. Searanox stared, frozen and slack-jawed, as Estiori literally fell into pieces like an ancient golden statue, laughing the entire time. His hands leapt to his eyes, trying to blot the image out. Her skull was still there, twin pricks of green light where the eyes once were, the jaw flapping as she continued to laugh. It's lovely, Searanox," she said, before her skull caved in entirely, pressed down by some unknown force. Searanox let out a blood-curdling scream, pressing back against the wall. The altar tipped and the urn was tossed into the air. The architect's other hand jerked forward and her eyes widened a bit as the urn shattered upon the ground. Golden ash whooshed across the floor like sand, almost soundless save for its own weight upon itself. The Great Red continued to scream, such a strange sound for a grown dragon to make, as he fell to his belly and clawed on his own face and brow. The horror. He could not bear it. What was happening? Having released the image of her puppet, the architect's eyes narrowed in amusement. Though Searanox could not see her, protected as she was, he hadn't the slightest inkling what was happening. His suffering was delicious. "Estiori!" he cried out like a great wounded animal. Sobs racked him and he fell upon his side, filled with grief and agony. He suffered well. The architect was pleased to see this. It only took a short time for him to curl into a corner, shivering violently, his mind broken. His mouth was agape, eyes wide with fear and staring at absolutely nothing. Stepping at last into the open, the architect smiled inwardly. She looked upon her fallen foe, golden magics clouding his eyes. Such a mighty creature, to have such an exploitable chink in his armor. Her green eyes glittering with raw magics, she sent another phantom giggle through the room. Estiori's giggle. Searanox twitched, holding his face and curling up like a terrified hatchling. He shivered visibly as though waiting to be struck by some unseen force, whimpering aloud. Having reduced him to a quivering mass for the moment, the architect turned to leave. Azurea stood on the doorway, her eyes wide and mouth agape. The architect was not fast enough to throw up her physical shield, for lightning had blasted forth from the angry dragoness's maw. The explosion of split air pushed the architect backwards as she held her arms up in defense. The arc of blue energy split in 4 ways, plastering the wall and blowing chunks off of the sacred shrine's perfectly smooth paneling. You! Azurea limped into view, snarling viciously.
You?
The architect said in an equally surprised voice, eyes widening in their slits. Why was she not dead? Was dropping her from above the clouds through a rainstorm into a fortress of rabid folk not enough? The golden-armored figure's mind raced, plans altering rapidly because of Azurea's survival.
How did you survive?
She demanded. You dropped me among friends, not foes, Azurea hissed, her tail raising up and her body inflating a bit as she made ready for combat. Broken leg or no, she'd done something terrible to Searanox to make him cry out in such a way. She hobbled forward in a painful loping motion. Her tail whip snapped forward, the sonic boom of the motion like a crack of blue lightning. The architect crossed her arms, brunting most of it and skidding along the floor at the sheer force. Azurea was surprised she'd not struck some sort of impenetrable barrier, but would not turn her nose up at the development. Turning sideways, she gritted her teeth and pressed her assault, folding her wings protectively and trying to press her into one of the walls. The architect grunted with effort as Azurea steered her around the room. She'd spent far too much of her magics upon the puppets and the mind-affecting spells. Far too much. Suddenly there was a metallic clanging and a chip of the helm flew off, tinkling upon the ground. Grasping her helm where it was broken, she summoned up all of her might for a flat-panel golden tower shield. Willed into existence, the barrier held the flailing Azurea at bay. She glanced over the quivering Searanox and the spilled ashes. Torment and misery achieved for the moment, she could do little else with the angry dragoness protecting him. Swearing inwardly, she gave a flick of her mind. Azurea reared up in a bit of a panic as the portal ripped open on the wall behind the architect. She backed up a bit, not wanting to be sent to another random location. A great crack had appeared in the architect's armor, which made her blanch. Holding her barrier ahead of herself, the demigod walked backward slowly, her fiery green eyes sending hatred into Azurea's. The portal slammed shut with a crack of thunder, and Searanox let out a doggish yelp of fear. The dragoness stood there, wondering if she'd really seen what she thought she had seen. Shaking her head quickly, she limped to her mate, looking upon him fearfully. "Searanox?" she called gingerly. "Those eyes. Histori's beautiful green eyes." He moaned into his curled-up position, his head tucked fearfully under his black wings. So terrible. He was quivering all over, as though driven to madness. His breathing was ragged, uneven, and gasping. Azurea touched him, and he flinched hard, yapping like he'd been struck. She looked around the ruined shrine. The altar was tipped, the urn shattered, offerings strewn about and some even broken. Though Searanox gave weapons as offerings, they were still just as sacred as incense or the like. Even the excellent painting of Estiori was tilted on the wall, a slash mark across it from where Azurea's lightning breath had blasted a part of the wall near it. She frowned guiltily. It was the only image she'd ever seen of the beautiful dragoness, and it was now ruined. She felt a pang of jealousy for her shining beauty and silvery gold eyes. She stopped staring close. "Searanox!" she shouted over his blubbering. "Estiori has silver eyes. Silver!" she roared, forcing his wing aside and grabbing his head with all her might. He yelped pathetically. "Look! Look at the painting, she commanded forcefully, steering his head by the horns. Look at her! Searanox looked, still gasping and quivering. Silver. Not green, he acknowledged. You've been played, Azurea said, slapping his right cheek a few times and trying to snap him out of it. I do not know what you saw, but it was not true. Searanox stood at the lip of the shrine of Estiori, ears wilted down as his neck bowed. He'd been had, badly. It was as though it were all a dream turned into a vicious nightmare. He looked at the horrible mess that had been made, though it had taken some time for Azurea to coax him back to the sanctity of his calm. It did not change what had happened. After telling all that had transpired, he'd felt ashamed, thinking he was back in the olden days, wooing Estiori, no thought of Azurea having ever crossed his mind. The urn was shattered upon the ground, and Estiori's ashes had been scattered everywhere in the fuss. He turned his paw over, finding flecks of it in his claws. He was ashamed. He felt Azurea's presence behind him. She approached slowly. "Searanox?" his mate said in a soothing way. His head swung slowly about to look at her. His molten orange eyes were miserable. She limped closer and he felt worse, looking at her broken leg. She caught where his eyes were going. "Look now, I don't want you to dwell here any longer." She was taking a more forward approach. "Estiori is long gone, and the architect was using her image to torment you." Azurea leaned upon him. "But she is weakening, my mate. I don't know why, but I cracked her armor when we fought," she confessed. He looked at her sharply, as though about to call her a liar. "I don't know why either. She seems weaker." The blue dragoness furrowed her brow. "I suspect there is more going on than we know, but if it presses our own advantage, we must take it." She put a paw upon his breast, at the glittering gem that was his heart. He nodded slowly, his expression softening into sadness as he looked at the shrine once more. Azurea saw he was not coming away from that wreckage easily. There was a long silence, and she wilted a bit. "I'll leave you be," she said finally, pulling away from him and turning down the tunnel once more. Limping as she went, she spoke over her shoulder. "Perhaps when you are done mourning your dead mate, you can focus on your current one." The words cut Searanox worse than any sword, and his head dipped guiltily. She left him there. After staring at the broken scene for a long time, he mumbled his first beloved's name to close the way, and returned to the hoard room. The next few days were awkward ones, to say the least. Azurea was distant. Searanox felt guilty, and any conversation felt strained and short. She didn't allow him to fuss over her very much, other than bring some fresh food because she still could not fly. Even then, he could sense resentment. Searanox stared at his food, curling his tail about himself. Finally, he took a breath to draw her attention. "I am sorry," he said deeply. She looked up at him mildly, a cow intestine hanging from her jaws like spaghetti. She cocked her head some. From the dragon that did not lie, she could tell something profound was about to happen. "I have been clinging to the past with that room. It is foolish, and I should be looking forward with you as my mate, Azurea. Estiori is gone. I should not be thinking of her," he said slowly and carefully. He stared at the bloody remains of horse meat in front of him, rather than at her. Now and then his gaze would flick up to make sure she was still looking at him, but then back down again. His wings drooped down and extended out, no longer folded regally upon his back for comfort. The two of you are so similar. It is scary sometimes. Both running from aristocratic families, both powerful, beautiful, playful, forceful. It is as though I got a second chance, and I shouldn't be thinking of it that way.
What do you mean? Azurea said softly.
I should not think of you as a second Estiori, he blurted miserably, but sometimes I have been.
The Great Red confessed it.
I am sorry to have kept it from you, but even when you came to live with me, half of myself and my powers lingered in that room, with what remained of her.
She was slowly standing, an aggressive motion of some apprehension. He flinched just a little, trying to be a male and bare his soul for his mate.
But I cannot any longer.
He chanced to look into her eyes, but could not take her intensity as he was then. Azurea approached, and he dreaded her striking him with her tail, but she did not. Instead, she sighed and sat on her haunches next to him. Her injured wing quivered painfully open, extending over his back and grasping at his shoulder. Searanox looked at her as she leaned on him for support. If you have the courage to say such things, then it means you are moving on, she said, resting her head on his shoulder. He did not dare take her horns into his teeth, though he ached to. Anything just to touch her. There was a long silence.
I forgive you,
she whispered. Searanox shuddered visibly, lowering his ears and head to put under her chin. Leaning into the dominant position, she tucked his head under her own and nuzzled his horns. A soft, please gurgling was all Searanox dared to produce. They stayed like that for a long time, until Azurea's brow furrowed in sudden thought. What do you mean half of your powers were in that room with her? She suddenly pulled away to look at him.
Searanox said, looking embarrassed. Well, when the architect and I tried to resurrect Estiori, I gave half of my draconic power to the spell. It didn't work, he said, cocking his head as he explained. My powers are still in that urn.
Were in that urn, with her ashes. He frowned miserably when he remembered that they were scattered on the floor everywhere. Half of your powers? Your dragon fear? Your strength? Azurea looked up at him, blinking with disbelief. Just sitting there in that urn all these decades? She didn't believe him. Are you lying to me? The blue dragoness frowned.
It's not as though I can just go down there and extract them. They're gone.
Searanox shrugged with a frown.
I gave half of myself to the spell, which, in hindsight, probably wasn't a resurrection spell at all, if the architect was my enemy all this time.
He suddenly winced at the obviousness of it all.
She must have wanted to drain me of anything she could, right from the beginning.
Magic is never gone, Searanox, Azurea said urgently. It doesn't burn like flesh on the pyre. She turned her head slowly. Dear gods! She was looking down towards the tunnel that led to the shrine.
What is it? Searanox wanted to know.
Half of your powers are in those ashes, Searanox, Azurea said. Still in those ashes. She looked up at him in wonder. You've grown so strong since you gave up half. How much more? She trailed off and shuddered a bit. She didn't want to think of the result. She put a paw on her chest. Searanox, I want you to listen to me very closely, she said with some urgency, and you must let me finish. Do not interrupt. He blinked, then nodded at her. Promise? Good. You said the architect demanded half of your powers to make a resurrection spell work, and even then it failed. Suppose she was just channeling out a good chunk of you and placing it in Estiori's body, knowing you would dispose of it in some fashion. She was counting on you to give most of yourself and then dispose of it. The puzzle pieces were falling into place as she spoke, eyes growing wide. But you didn't. You burned her on a pyre and kept the ashes. Magic doesn't burn like flesh. It's still there. She seized his shoulders with some strength, rearing up so they were eye to eye. You can go and get your powers back, right now. Reclaim them and restore yourself. She was grinning like mad by now, and Searanox furrowed a brow. How? I don't know how magic works very well. I needed instructions for our armbands after all, and my fiery breath is not magical. You know that. He frowned at her. How? The same way you get any other energies into your body, Searanox. Azurea was excited now, having solved a chunk of their puzzle. The architect will come back for us. You must restore yourself. Searanox sat on his haunches, Azurea across from him. They'd spent hours and hours cleaning up the shrine of Estiori. Using very steady paws they'd gathered the ash, and Azurea had even taken on her rabbit form to sweep. Gathering the ashes into several crates once meant for food, they moved it about into the hoard room. They'd done all they could. Estiori's remains glittered in the greater light, and Searanox felt his stomach turn. "You're sure this will work?" he asked his mate. "This is unbelievably blasphemous to the dead." He worried somewhat. "You'll not be claimed by Tiamat for wanting to return to your former self, my mate," Azurea assured him, lying down on her belly and folding her wings. "But eating the ashes? This was once a living dragoness," Searanox said, looking down and sniffing idly. "Well, it's not going to taste very good if that's what you mean," she balked at him, frowning. "And with the ashes gone, perhaps you'll spend less time in that shrine, staring about with a vacant expression." The words hit home, and she looked at him apologetically. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean..." It's all right." He shook his head, returning his gaze to the task at hand. Searanox frowned at the crates, then looked up at her. "You have the... oh, good." Azurea was pouring a pair of water barrels in case something went horribly wrong and he needed to cleanse his mouth. Heaving a great breath to steady himself, Searanox leaned down and nosed the ashes a bit. "Forgive me," he whispered to them, speaking to Estiori. "I must move on," he said slowly, much to Azurea's quiet approval. His long tongue slowly lapped out, forked and pressing into the pile of gold-flecked ash. Azurea watched in silence as the fire dragon consumed all 3 crates. He even crushed the wooden bits in his jaws, choking down everything. His stomach was strong, and most dragons could eat anything. But this... "Are you all right?" she asked softly when he held his midsection and sat on his haunches again. His face was troubled, understandably troubled. He belched golden sparks with a gasp, holding himself again. "Do you feel sick? Do you need water?" She limped to him, rolling the water barrel with her. Searanox shuddered, closing his eyes and tilting his head back. Azurea reached forward with her supernatural senses. She touched Searanox with her scanning mind. It was as though something great were under pressure, some hot, sweating, molten thing with a brittle stopper on it. All one would need to do is yank the chain and free it. The great red's body shuddered again,
Azurea could feel something mixing within him, taking on new shape to her extra senses. Very suddenly, a tinkling sound drew Azurea's eye down. Searanox's heart had popped out of his chest. She gasped in horror, grabbing it up and palming his chest to put it back, but the hole was gone. Her eyes widened and she limped backward a little. In the palm of her paw she felt a vibration. A real heart. An organ, not a gem. She looked at the shining thing in her paw as its magical glow began to flicker and die. She dropped it, slowly turning her gaze to look on her mate again. "Searanox?" she whispered. Searanox purred. "Oh." It was the sound she'd only ever heard him make after love-making, a satiated sigh of happy exhaustion. She looked down when she saw a round gem rolled over the toes and away. She lifted one of the front paws, looking around. Anything not held down by the weight of other things was moving away from Searanox, as though some pressing force was letting off ringlets centered on his body. He belched sparks, purring again with pleasantly closed eyes. Azurea limped backward a few more steps, not sure what to make of the development. "Yes." Searanox squirmed just a little bit, as though bathing in the hot afternoon sun. Bending his back like a bow, he drank in the gathering heat of power growing in his belly. "I'd forgotten. Feels amazing," he murmured, licking his chops and smacking his lips a few times. His jowls lifted to reveal all his fangs. The mountain shuddered as another ringlet forced mounds of coins and gems away from Searanox. Azurea's nervousness grew, as though some proverbial twig were about to break and bring the whole mountain down upon them. She'd seen Dragonfear make such rings before, but now he seemed content to sit where he was, head tilted up like he were enjoying sunlight. "Searanox? Can you hear me in there?" Azurea pressed bravely, putting her paw on his shoulder and grasping at him. She heard the sound of drawing swords, and her head snapped towards his tail. Blood spurted from him as an extra pair of tail blades exploded forth, jagged and serrated on both sides. She watched him lean forward and moan as two of his horns became putty and molded themselves out much longer than before. They pointed directly forward now, aligned with Searanox's jawline. His mane exploded with length, long like silken rope. He gritted his teeth, and Azurea felt the molten pressure her supernatural senses had felt before increase to the bursting point. His claws grew and curved wickedly, turning from a shining black to a horrific onyx. "Searanox?" Azurea said fearfully. Finally he lowered his head, still purring softly. His molten eyes opened, looking upon her with a lover's gaze. "Azurea." White steam erupted from his mouth. Azurea's eyes widened at the sight of his. Once orange, they'd migrated to bright and glowing yellow. "My Azurea," he said slowly, shivering pleasantly. He leaned over her and she made visible effort not to pull away. He nuzzled his way through her mane, a gurgling laugh deep down in his chest. "The power feels good." He was speaking in slow fragments, as though in awe of how he felt. "Searanox the Feared, are you okay? Are you still you?" she whispered, half fearful of him as his draconic aura murmured through the very crevice of the mountain lair now. She lowered her head some, like he might decide to bite if she offended him. "No more the feared, beloved." Hot erotic steam ran over Azurea's neck and shoulders.
She gave a soft little yip of surprise, and heat colored her face. Though his voice was a whisper, it carried the power to tremble the very air it travelled upon. "I am whole again, like you thought I would be. Searanox of the Red Flame." Act 3, Part 4. Revelation. The architect staggered through the portal and onto all fours on the ground. It crashed shut with a crack of thunder behind her. Grasping at the ground with one hand, she held her helm with the other, cracked. Her shell had been cracked, not even by Searanox but his wretched mate, Azurea of the blue sky. Had she truly grown so powerful in the months that she'd been there with the Great Red?
No! No!
She assured herself, her voice gargling as though she had drainage in her throat. Her consciousness wavered and she fell onto her side.
I strain myself too hard. Mind spells, illusions, phantom sounds for hours on end. Too much. Too...
The glittering green of her eyes in the slits of her helm flickered out, as true unconsciousness claimed her, for the first time in decades. Lyser turned her nose up at her mate, and we are supposed to see this random animal who has crawled out from some dingy cave just because he wills it so? Huh! He looked at her with a stubborn, commanding look, and she wavered a bit, putting her head under his chin and nuzzling with her long golden mane. She apologized for questioning his wisdom. "I will at least be quick about it. I've better things to do with my day than listen to the mewling of an animal like Searanox of the Red Flame," her mate allowed, nuzzling and nipping at her neck with some affection. His virile handsomeness and long golden body reminded her of a streak of lightning, frozen in the very room she was in. He smiled at her, biting lightly until she gasped and giggled rather excitedly. "Come, we shall see him together." He turned himself about and made for the great hall. She followed him. When they both were coiled up like divine serpents, they nodded to the nearest servant. The smaller dragon slunk along the ground, her head held low with respect as she crossed the great hall and went to the double doors. Grabbing the great metal ring with her teeth, she gave a strangled yelp as the massive doors were flung open from the outside. A great billowing black smoke rolled into the hall, and a pair of bright orange eyes travelled with them. Snarling preceded the scraping sound of something sharp splitting the tiles on the floor. Lyser squinted, but gathered her willpower to make her paws stay at the floor and not leap to her ears against the awful sound. It was nerve-wracking. The guards bristled as the black smoke permeated into the room. The spice of fire and the musk of the wild male dragon spread quickly. Her nose wrinkled a little. It was not a bad smell, but still far more pungent than the light perfumes of the courtly life she was used to. 5 strong warrior dragons made a loose semicircle around the lord of the house, and herself as they seated themselves more upright on massive pillows where they held the court. Slowly, great black wings rose up and out of the billow of smoke, liquid night with red fingers. The wings gave a flap, and there he stood, Searanox of the Red Flame. He was a handsome thing, despite the angry glare upon his face. His thick armoured scales were a light crimson, his blades upon his tail a dark grey, almost black. He was a paragon of his species, the angry reds of the mountain caves. "I have come for my mate, Estiori of the Central House of Gold," he said, his voice deep and syrupy. Despite his rudeness, Lyser could certainly see why her daughter had been attracted to him. Her heart ached briefly. Poor Estiori.
Your mating to our daughter is neither approved nor blessed, her maid said, scolding their visitor openly. There was some idle squirming by some of the servants. The tension in the room was palpable at Searanox's mere presence. She could already feel the bubbling, frothing dragon fear that he was trying to keep suppressed. She could sense the deep well of power within him, bred into the species by countless millennia of living in an uncivilized fashion. Like a wild beast's strength trumped a pampered princeling's. However, it was admirable that his first tactic had been diplomacy. His breed was known for its savagery, not its words. Red dragons need neither permissions nor blessings. We take what mates we want, upon their singular approval, Searanox said defiantly, the blades of his tail scraping loudly upon the perfect marble floor. The nearby servants winced, covering their ears. Lysidianexus frowned angrily at his insolence. How dare he speak thus to the head of a household, in his own home? She dishonours our family in finding company with the likes of you, Searanox of the red flame, she said acidly, glaring at him from under her brow. There was a hush in the grand hall. Even the sweeping pillars seemed stiller than normal, intent on listening to the venomous dance of angry words flying back and forth. The 6 warrior Gauls were looking at each other, then back to Searanox. None had ever encountered a great red before, so they were sizing him up in case things came to blows. Searanox's wings flapped open and she held her breath, but he closed them again against his back and she relaxed. Agitated body language, but he was still standing at a safe distance and speaking. She did not trust him not to leap upon her or her mate, not one bit. Animal. He glanced to one side, and the servant scurried behind columns and out of view from his molten gaze. You stole her from my lair while I was away. You will give her back, or risk hostilities between our houses, he said with an air of very fake snootiness. White smoke curled from his nostrils, and she briefly wondered how a great red could choose between a black and white smoke to rise from their breath. Other than his dragon fear, she could sense no magic in him at all. Both Lysidianexus and her mate chuckled melodically at his silly, empty threat. We have nothing to fear from you, red dragon, much less your family. Do not threaten us with an ununified force of loners, her mate said smugly. Red dragons, they all knew, did not live together or even gather very often. Threatening them with a force of reds was not only fabrication, but a rather shallow lie at that. Did he think that they knew nothing? How childish! That aside, she is no longer give-able. She glanced over at him when he said this, her heart mildly aching for her lost daughter. He said it so callously. She'd loved Estiori dearly, but their laws demanded. What had happened? Searanox's dragon fear rippled, but only a bit. She could feel it like a light breeze on her cheek, attuned to the invisible forces of magic, unlike her mate. She could see the argument on a deeper level. Searanox was on the cusp. What have you done with her? The great red reared up a bit, growling threateningly and sending the servants scrambling. Lysidianexus felt the subtle tremor in the grand hall. Searanox's strength was seeping into the walls, into the columns, and the very air they breathed, bleeding it out like an invisible fog. I demand you. We tied her with bonds and dropped her into the nearest rabbit-folk castle. A merciful death for dishonoring our traditions and family laws, she blurted, barely able to keep her voice from cracking with emotion. It wasn't as though she wanted to kill her own daughter, her Estiori. The law demanded it, and they had obeyed.
She slowly turned about herself as though her body was a massive rope, sitting up a bit higher so to steady herself. She saw the open shock upon his face, and the slitted shrinking of his pupils. You killed her," he said, aghast and quivering in the wingtips. Lysidianexus watched his long neck bow like a swan's, saw his sides heave rapidly while he hyperventilated in distress. His large jowls rose to reveal sword-like grimace, and his claws pressed hard to the marble tile. They cracked, whining like ice expanding into stone. Her mate gave a huff of impatience. He knew the topic was sensitive to this house, and he would not be ripping the wound open by letting it bleed again, especially not for his mate. She met his eyes for a split moment while Searanox huffed in wild anger, glaring into the ground. "We have many other children. Our line will continue," he growled at the Great Red, coiling himself up and sitting higher like his mate had done. With both of them seated at the same level, they felt unified as a proper couple should be. She saw Searanox shudder and gave a start as he uttered a great cry. Great, heartbroken cry that turned her blood cold. "Stay your animal tongue, Red Dragon," her mate snapped, having recovered half a moment faster than she. "We will not fear your savagery in our own house." She watched the half-dozen warrior golds stand cautiously forward, armed with great spears and armor. They would, at the very least, see him away and beat him for a bit for his insolence. It was his own fault for coming to the very heart of their territory and acting such. Lysidianexus felt some of the lighter hairs of her mane prickling. What was that feeling? She turned her head only slightly, her senses reaching out to find the source. Dragon fear was slowly gripping the room around them, anchored onto Searanox like a million tiny heads in a madhouse of a spider's web. His fearful aura was saturating the room, and it was crackling like stone under too much pressure. She frowned idly, licking her chops to wet her lips. "Fear me." Searanox's whisper was a terrible one, and she fought down a shudder. He mumbled the next bit, and she didn't hear. "What?" She leaned forward a bit, trying to see Searanox's eyes veiled behind his white mane. "You will fear me." The Great Red's head tossed back, and he looked into the skylight above them all. She saw the glitter of the feral intelligence glide over his gaze, and she felt a sudden rising panic. "You will all fear me." His voice rose, and she thought she heard some sort of clicking sound. Red dragons in a kilns made that sound. The guards closed in around him, ready to protect the heads of the household from searing flame. "You will all fear me." Her brow rose as he reared up like an angry snake, and with two quick and savage breaths blasted balls of fire into the two of the supporting columns. Her breath caught in her throat as she felt a powerful jarring of dragon fear, exploding from Searanox like a powerful wave. The columns buckled. "You fool! The roof!" Her mate started desperately uncoiling himself to make for the side door, and very suddenly the roof started coming down in a single, pressing force of death. Lysidianexus's scream was of terror and short-lived, for she was frozen to the spot with a sudden burst of dragon fear from Searanox. She heard the cries of the dying, and darkness covered her as did the rubble. She heard herself cry out, felt the bones shatter, felt something inside her burst. Her stomach? Her lungs? She didn't know. She moaned in agony, trying to draw breath but barely able to move at all. Squirming in the crushing weight, she balled her body up so that she could breathe just a little. Using all her strength, she judged which way up was, and tried to squirm to the surface wherever she could find cracks or loose rubble.
It was pure, white-hot agony. She shuddered, gagging on her own blood and fighting with all her spirit to try and stay alive. If she fell unconscious, she would die. Gritting her teeth and trying to ignore the coppery taste of blood in her mouth, she used the last of her strength trying to break to the surface. She heard the tinkling of glass. Her mate had made it out. Surely that was him. Perhaps he'd somehow wormed free and was looking for her. She tried to say his name, but gagged blood instead. Moaning in pain, she poked her head slowly out of the wreckage and her eyes screwed up at the bright light. Shuddering a little, she saw it was not her mate, but Searanox of the Red Flame. How had he survived? She couldn't even choke out the hateful words in her heart, spurting blood from her mouth as she tried. At the end of her strength, it was all she could do to bring her head the rest of the way out of the wreckage, so she could see properly. He was covered with glass. Perhaps he'd stood under the skylight. Clever monster. She could not look into his eyes, but felt his molten gaze upon her. His hatred was almost tangible, like heat. Lysa Dianexis could feel the dragon fear pulsing around her, and she could not recoil when he came closer. He leaned down, his gaze like orange fire. Searanox looked as though he might bite her face for a moment, but his long muzzle passed hers until his lips came to her ear instead. "Your mate was wrong," he whispered to her in his deep, syrupy voice. "Your line will end with you." She moaned, squirming futilely to free the rest of herself from the rubble of her home. Gagging a bit, she heard the spatter of blood on the pavement beneath her. He suddenly reached out and grabbed her by the horn, hissing with wild anger. Her mind spun with fear until it was blotted with pain when he struck. She could not draw enough breath to cry out. He held her down by the horns, and struck her again and again and again. She could feel things coming loose. That would mean her death. The pain made her weep quietly for mercy, but there was none to be had. Her world was descending into inky blackness. The red monster would not relent. She could feel her blood pooling. Lysa Dianexis whimpered. The architect heaved herself upright, panting a little, growling and holding her faceplate a moment. She forced herself to stand on visibly shaky legs, walking promptly to the pyramid temple where her throne lay. She collapsed into it and lifted a hand enshrouded with the golden aura. Gold bricks wrenched themselves from the ground, moulding themselves into a strange, blobby shape as they instantly liquefied. She willed it so. The entire thing splashed upon her like a tired runner might throw cold water upon his face to reinvigorate himself. She groaned, her back arching as she drank in the magical properties of the metal. Like reversing a spill, the puddles of steaming hot metal worked its way into the cracks of her armor and up into her faceplate. Smoothed over, it looked good as new. Sighing a bit, she sat upright at last, back to normal. She could not keep doing this, she knew. Then, as though on cue, came a figure to remind her. A great golden dragon, coiled up upon himself. The architect frowned at him, unappreciative of his handsomeness. He cocked his head at her, eyeing her up and down with his disapproving stare. Translucent like a spirit, he slowly uncoiled himself, long and snake-like upon the ground. The wind whispered more than one voice, though he tried to make his the closest one to audible. "Avenge us," the wind whispered. The architect sat regal upon her throne, her eyes narrowing into a hard look. She would not be bullied by spirits from beyond the veil. Showing no signs of acknowledgement to his commands, she inclined her head to see past him. On the very dimmest end of her furthest magical visions, she could see them, dozens of them, all writhing back and forth in some tangled ball of long bodies, shining like the sun, but tortured like the damned in their thirst and refusal to pass completely on to the next existence. How many dragons did it take to achieve such a stubborn feat? Quite a few. Avenge us, the wind insisted, blowing a bit harder. Smouldering at their voices, the architect stood violently.
Be still!
She roared. The golden dimension shuddered, and she clutched her tiny fists.
I stand atop you all.
She glared at them from afar.
I took Searanox's heart. I tricked him out of half of his powers, and I shall be the one to end him when I please.
A spherical golden aura pressed around her, though there was no living being around to feel it. The ground shook. The handsome golden dragon was still moving upon it, until he curled slowly around her like a massive snake. Great loops of his body left enough room to walk a few paces, but the entrapment was much the same, comforting. He looked down at her, his muzzle almost touching her chest. She reached to stroke his face, but her hand could not feel him. Not as she was now. Her heart, or whatever remained, ached for the golden dragons and who he was before her. None deserved their fate. She looked up, seeing his stern look, and lowered her head apologetically. I am your vengeance for the 5 houses of gold. Forgive my arrogance. The spectre tilted his head slightly, gentle in his gaze. It takes so much magic to hold me together anymore. It's been decades. She slowly sank to her knees, her golden armor clanking crudely.
So much.
She gave a sudden start with the filigree grass tilted a certain way, carrying a scent on the wind. Searanox the Feared, nay, Searanox of the Red Flame. The architect stood, green eyes glittering sharply.
So then,
she whispered,
he figured it out. Or more likely she did.
Her eyes narrowed into a gaze of cold calculation. Then
And
I've no more time. Searanox will consolidate his powers soon. She turned to look at the handsome gold. I must go forward now. There is no more time to taunt and torture him, she told the spirit, who nodded with barely veiled eagerness. It made him look bloodthirsty, but the architect was the only one who could read his body language so closely. Turning, she looked up at the temple pyramid. She had made it look impressive, all a part of the act for Searanox, but 'twas not the true purpose. She walked up to its side, placing her hands upon it. Closing her eyes and tilting her helm forward just a bit, she slowly seized up with concentration, before melting slowly into the structure itself. Once at its heart, its very center, she began to feed. Azurea's mood was certainly light, given that her leg was broken and her wing was only just starting to obey her once more. It had been almost a week since the last appearance of the architect, and while they'd initially not left each other's side, she and Searanox had eased down a hair. Searanox of the Red Flame was an affectionate, happy thing most of the time. He'd not mounted her recently, but she'd recently had a few rather embarrassing bite marks along her neck. His new form had mildly tainted his arrogant persona, but he was still heady with power, and that was understandable. A greater chunk of himself returned, much like his heart, would take time to get used to. It seemed that all his bits and pieces were back now. Azurea giggled at the thought of hunting for more pieces of Searanox. Surely 2 puzzle pieces was enough to finish the complete picture here. Shaking her head and continuing down the tunnel, she stopped and admired the knowledge room. She'd reorganized the entire thing, and had taken to poring over this book or that lately, to pass the time. Though she knew the architect might be upon them at any moment, it did no good to sit and worry constantly. Searanox was out hunting at the moment, for example, so she would content herself with another dusty tome of who knew what. She liked that it was so near to her sanctuary. She could read in private and not be disturbed. The thunderous explosion of magic knocked her over, and she yelped at the pain in her leg. A portal ripped itself open on the wall, and the architect stepped out, green eyes ablaze. She gasped, turning and loping clumsily down the tunnel.
Azurea of the blue sky,
the armored figure hissed, searing gaze following her as she fled. Starting forward at a brisk walk, she followed the dragoness through the winding passage.
I'll be returning that little kiss you gave me earlier.
She pointed to her faceplate. Although repaired, the ego behind it was still injured. Following quickly behind the limping dragoness, she saw her long tufted tail disappear behind what looked like a curtain.
Hide and seek. Very well,
she sighed with impatience.
I have absorbed more gold than you covetous things can imagine. You will not be able to harm me anymore.
The architect threatened with a half-truth, stepping up to the archway. There was a little plate of silver at the top of it, some crude decoration, and a velvety curtain blocking the room beyond. She stepped forward, leaning to peek at her first. Her faceplate, and a good portion of her helm, melted off with a boil of sudden powerful magic. The architect recoiled with a roar of surprise and pain, her hands leaping up to cup at the front of her head. Azurea stuck her head out through the curtain and lightning blasted from her maw with a crack of thunder. Her ears rang and she watched the architect bounce from the opposite wall and roll like a skipping stone in the recoil. "Got you!" she said triumphantly, coming forward to claim her prize and bite her in half. The architect gagged, turning onto all fours and jerking her head hard to look at Azurea. A perfect oval-shaped portion of the faceplate and helm were missing, but there was only an abyssal and blackness beyond. She could not see a face, a head, or even the back of the helm, only darkness. The sight made Azurea shriek, for only a pair of green points of light stared back at her. A horrible growling sound emerged from the darkness, and the architect stood slowly. A slow, molten presence was melting out of the hole, invisible but everywhere. It saturated the tunnel, and the very rock that made it. The dragoness's mouth went agape. She was held in place by a terrible fear. No, dragon fear. Azurea's eyes widened just a bit more. "You're a dragon!" she accused, backing up a pace or two. "I can feel your dragon fear." There was a mild halt in the architect's movement that told her it was true, a sort of startlement at being found out. Slowly, the architect's gauntleted hand came up, touching the rims of the melted hole. The sanctuary spell had been idle. She'd not sensed it until it was too late and she'd stuck her head into the archway. Feeling foolish, she traced a fingertip around the edge with a slow, deliberate motion.
"Clever sky dragoness,"
she said, the twinkles of green light in the blackness narrowing just a bit. She stepped back, reaching into the deep well of magic she'd absorbed. The helm slowly melted over, remoulding and shaping itself into a muzzled face. A dragoness's face.
"I did not think Searanox would remember my face,"
she said, then reforming into the featureless faceplate once more, the eyes in their slits burning with anger. "Estiori?" Azurea shouted, unable to believe it when she saw the facial features.
"Ha! No.
The architect was insulted, but laughed at the accusation. "My daughter died decades ago.
I am Lycidianexus,
the High Matriarch of the Central House of Gold."
Act 3, Part 5, Finale. Azurea folded her wings and threw herself into a sanctuary, just as molten fire rushed down the tunnel. The architect was caught in the blast, shielding herself with her magic in her forearm. Squinting through the inferno, she saw him, Searanox of the Red Flame.
You magnificent bastard. There you are.
She mumbled under her breath. If she were more than a shell, she would have smiled, so instead her eyes glittered with grand interest. The shape of those horns, the extra blades upon the tail, the swollen dragon fear his presence was giving off. This was the Searanox from decades ago. Thrusting her arms out and spreading her legs a bit, the architect turned towards the great red and encased herself in a sphere of golden light. Shielded from his flames, she relaxed and folded her arms, waiting for the fires to end. When Searanox's breath ran out, he lowered his head and snarled savagely. Dragon fear hummed in the air.
You were always the one guest I enjoyed having. Why stab me in the back now?
He demanded. She began walking forward, and he began walking backward, away from the injured Azurea in her sanctuary.
What have you to gain by losing your best customer? Are you affiliated with the Golds?
They worked their way up the tunnels.
I was. But all of us are dead now, if you recall.
The architect gestured when they emerged into the horde room with Searanox still walking backward.
You slaughtered my entire family, murderer.
The word was punctuated with a pressing force of golden magics that shuddered Searanox's mighty frame. Small though she was compared to him, if she were a dragon, size would not matter. Coins, pearls, and gems pitched themselves away from the architect for a moment, and she carved a path along the stone floor of the horde room.
You slaughtered my mate first,
Searanox said.
She was my daughter!
The architect snapped, and the mountain shuddered at her anger.
She was my mate!
Searanox roared back.
You made me this way.
The architect gestured to herself.
Caved my head in, so I had to think fast and hide in this god's-forsaken shell. It took me weeks to emerge from that wreckage of my own home.
Searanox went silent, leaning forth with narrowed eyes.
You're the matriarch,
he said slowly, recalling the memory she spoke of.
the one that crawled from the ruins.
They were slowly circling each other now, and out of the corner of his eye Searanox saw Azurea's nose poke out of a tunnel. He put the architect's back to her and stopped.
I remember you.
I'm flattered.
The architect lifted her hand and a long blade formed there. Her hand and most of her lower arm was gone. Now it was all a weapon.
You killed all 5 houses of gold. I wasn't sure I'd stand out.
Of course. You and your mate killed mine.
Searanox's tail was scraping along the ground, threatening to strike at this moment.
I'd remember your face forever.
To oblige him, the architect molded her golden helm into a more accurate representation of her face. It was odd to see, a body with 2 arms and 2 legs with the head of a dragon, no tail, no wings, just odd.
There you are,
Searanox said, nodding slowly in recognition.
Yes, my name is...
She barely had time to throw up her shield before Searanox's tail blade scuffed off of them with a magnificent spray of golden sparks. A fireball blasted across it after that. Using his turning momentum, the great red pumped his wings and lifted into the air for a moment, only to crash down upon the architect with all his might and weight. Her magical shield bent.
Gold is a soft metal,
architect," Searanox snarled, pressing in upon her with his crown of horns and both paws of full claws. "And so shall you be, when I'm done with you."
"I unmade you once, Searanox the Feared. I can unmake you again."
Skirting to one side to pitch Searanox's mountainous weight away from herself, she leapt up upon a mound of gold and gems. Raising both hands with green eyes burning, she reached deep into the well of magics and clutched at the great red. Searanox roared in agony as his back bent like a bow. His chest erupted into flames, blackened scales flailing away as vaguely heart-shaped burning began to ignite his body. She was removing his heart once more, this time by force. Lightning blasted over the small of the architect's back, and she grunted, driven to her knees. Azurea stood shakily against the tunnel wall, her hiding spot revealed, panting. Concentration lost, the architect released Searanox and whirled on her. He turned using all of his momentum, and catching the golden being in the side with the sharp of his tail blades. She cried out, pitching across the hoard room and crashing into the wall. Cracks spider-webbed away from the impact, and she fell limp for a moment. A few shards of gold were lodged into Searanox's tail. Azurea threw him in an encouraging look. Though she could not wade into battle with a broken leg, she would do all she could. The architect stood slowly, liquid gold bleeding out of the blackness of her gouge in her armor's side. It flowed and bubbled over the wound, then molded itself back to its shimmering perfection.
Just like new,
she said, lifting the arm that was a blade. Charging forward and riding a closed chest down a dune of coins and gems, the architect leapt upon Searanox with a roar. The dragon met her with his massive claws outstretched. Dragon fear met golden aura. There was a concussion of thunder that shook the mountain on its foundations. The lair groaned threateningly, Azurea looking around in alarm. The mountain would not withstand such a battle, not for long. The titans danced. Though Searanox had to crouch and use his teeth and horns, the architect was fast moving, and often was able to dodge before he could strike her down. Peppering her with a fireball, the great red tried to press his attacks. She swiped quickly, her blade sinking into his jowls. He roared, rearing up and slapping her weapon with his tail blades. Leaping upon him once more, she tried to aim for his face. The great red's chest was far too well armored. Around the eyes, lips, and under his arms were perhaps the only weak points as far as the blade was concerned. Azurea watched, her heart pounding. They were so close together, she could not try her lightning breath. She might hit her mate. Growling in frustration, she thought furiously, trying to consider anything at all that she could do to aid him. But nothing was springing to mind. She could conjure no weather inside, no cyclones or rivers to take into her claws and wield. Nothing. She had to get away for the moment, so Searanox could focus and not have to protect her in the tunnel where she stood. Loping painfully down the tunnel, she vanished from sight.
She abandons you, Searanox,
the architect said from the corner of her eye. They stopped a moment, panting at each other. A huge row of claw marks slowly melted away from the architect's breastplate, good as new, with some effort. Green steam seemed to be pouring lazily from her helm, from the eye slits for a moment. Searanox tilted his head down, reared up like an angry mountain goat, and thrust his crown of horns upon the architect. Her magical shielding broke for a moment, and she was driven to her knees by the powerful blow. Shaking her head quickly, she looked up just in time to see the great red's tail blades come down open upon her. The helm flew as shards of gold blasted off of her shoulders and neck. Searanox roared in triumph, wings spreading wide as the body pitched over like a rag doll. He'd done it. taken her head clean off. Leaping upon the golden figure, he crumpled what he could with his massive weight, using both paws. "Azurea! I've done it!" He turned to the tunnel, flapping his wings a bit. "Azurea!" He gave a roar of pain as a blade blossomed into his ribs, in the softest part of his flank. Reeling, he slapped at his attacker with his tail blades closed. The headless body of the architect was standing, one arm a broken weapon, for the long blade was still sticking out of Searanox's side. The neck hole was nothing but blackness, and he could see nothing within. Her entire frame shuddered as Searanox gaped at her in shock.
I told you, Searanox.
The sound was distant, reverberating an echo from someplace in the darkness.
You already killed me. This is just a shell.
The great red winced a little, cocking his head as the headless shape fumbled for the helm for a moment. Placing it back on her shoulders, she clenched her fists as once more she reached down into the well of magics she'd absorbed. The helm righted itself, the armor gleamed. Good as new. Searanox caught himself panting a little, and forced himself to stop. He was getting nowhere.
Remember my pyramid, where my throne was? I absorbed all that gold into myself. It's fueling me.
A new weapon sprouted from her arm.
And while you might beat me down, Searanox, again and again, I shall come back until you make a mistake, or wear down.
She chuckled a bit.
You may best me 100 times, and I only need to best you once. Then it will be.
Searanox chose that moment to renew his fiery onslaught, breathing fire over the golden figure with all his might. Meanwhile, Azurea was rushing down the tunnels looking for something, anything that could help. Then it dawned upon her. She stopped, turning around towards the hoard room. The shudders of battle rumbled down the tunnel at her. Turning about clumsily, because of her broken leg, she loped painfully forward on 3 legs towards her goal. Poking her head out of the tunnel, she saw Searanox tossed onto his back as the architect leapt upon him with a massive blade on her arm. She stabbed viciously back and forth, but little could be done to get through the great red's thick chest and belly scales. Living weapon though he was, he struggled back and forth with the armoured figure. Trying her best to remain unseen and uninteresting, Azurea skirted along the walls off to the side. She watched them fight, her heart clenching when she saw Searanox's lower side was bleeding. He was a vicious thing, so handsome in his element. Sniffing some, Azurea shut her eyes, extending her awareness outward. Points of light appeared to her consciousness. Anything in Searanox's lair that was magical stood out to her supernatural sense. The hoard room was especially bright, like looking at the night sky in her mind's eye. Where was it? Where? There! She flicked her eyes and dashed desperately towards what she wanted. Her leg exploded with angry pain. How dare she ignore a broken bone? Slowing, hissing and gasping in agony, she flapped her wings mildly, as though that might help her move faster. Thankful the hoard room was so big, she was safe to dig through the mounds of treasures until she came across a molten glob of gold, messy, and containing the remains of a stalwart knight. Looking quickly over at the architect and Searanox, she closed her eyes and tapped her armband. "Cuniculus," she whispered desperately. She gritted her teeth, praying. Suddenly her leg repaired itself, as she shrank into the nude form of a rabbit-folk woman. She remembered that when Axemis had broken her nose, the injury did not carry over into her dragon form, so her draconic injury would not have carried into her rabbit-folk shape. It was no way to heal oneself, but she would worry about that later. Rushing over to the globby shape, She ripped at it desperately, pushing coins and gems aside. Searanox swatted downwards with an open paw, flattening the architect where she stood. Lashing his tail forward when he released her, he chopped her in twin from his crotch to helm, once more pitching it off of the armored shell. His opponent growled from the inky blackness where she resided. Did he need to force the entire shell open and expose the darkness within? Grabbing the figure by the leg while the injury had slowed her, he savagely struck her over and over with his tail blades. The golden armor splintered back and forth, bending inward like cheap tin and groaning with each new blow. Laying spread-eagled, there was little the architect could do but simply take the abuse. When he'd torn open the chest cavity, the Great Red found it empty. No dark blob of evil magic or misty inky clouds pouring out like he expected. A dragon of very little magic. He wasn't sure what to do at that point. He stood over his opponent, watching everything rapidly slide back into place. The architect reformed herself in mere moments, standing and putting her hands on her hips to jeer at him.
I can keep this up as long as you can, beast,
she said with a snort. How long shall I wait to put a sword through your eye? Hours? Days? Maybe even put it somewhere worse. Her golden, pressing aura erupted very suddenly, and Searanox roared with effort to stay on his feet. Her hand once more became a long, this time curved blade. Anger boiling, he concussed the air with dragon fear to protect himself, squirming as the hoard room boiled with powerful magics. He watched coins drift upward to the ceiling and gems rolling idly along the walls.
I may not have my draconic body anymore, but you shall wear down far, far before I do.
Searanox panted, real sweat working its way down his jaw and chin. Checking his bleeding side only briefly, his eyes flicked up when he saw the figure of a rabbit-folk woman flitting amongst the dunes of gold. Who was that? Was she mad? The architect turned to look as well, grunting a question. She was a naked thing, running daintily along as not to harm her giant sensitive feet. In her hand she wielded a longsword covered with runes. The two of them stared as she fast approached, raising the sword to cut down the architect, who easily sidestepped and backhanded her with a gauntlet. She fell with a yelp, and the sword skittered to the side.
Please,
the architect said, folding her arms.
Do you think I do not know dragon's bane when I see it? I am not an
Searanox's fist, the sword clutched painfully between his two fingers, bashed mercilessly into her side. The golden figure gasped, the green eyes widening in their slits. She looked down slowly at the dragon-specific weapon sticking out of her side. Azurea the rabbit-folk woman turned, bleeding from the mouth. She held her jaw a bit, but managed to speak through it. "No, you just talk too much." Searanox mercilessly pressed it all the way to the hilt as she screamed, until it poked out of the other side of her armor. Pinned to the floor as the tip pressed into stone, she writhed like a bug set with a needle for display. Azurea scrambled away, bleeding from the mouth, to the safety of Searanox's undercarriage. One of his black wings came down to shield her. The architect looked at them, shocked.
But
she managed to gag out as liquid gold spattered from her mouth. "Body, spirit, or shell, whatever's left of you is still draconic." Searanox was backing up rapidly, carting the hidden Azurea with him. The architect reached for them, pinned to the spot and fear in her eyes. Her back arched like a bow, her head tilting back. She seemed to melt partially, a horrible moaning sound coming from deep within the hollow shell that made up her body. The helm split open like a warped stained glass window, displayed jagged golden teeth as she let out her death rattle. The green pinpricks of her eyes flickered, then hissed out like quenched flame. The architect fell into pieces, once more just a suit of armor and nothing more. There was silence, save for Searanox's labored breathing. Azurea poked her head out, then emerged from Searanox's undercarriage. She tapped the armband twice. Cuniculus! She exploded with sighs, then kneeled over in pain from her freshly broken leg. Moaning and hissing loudly, she looked over as Searanox examined the remains, handling the dragon's bane sword very carefully. Putting it to one side under a mound of gold, Searanox returned to her. "I think it's over," he whispered to her, nodding slowly. She smiled, sweating and heaving herself slowly upright. She looked around the lair-turned battlefield with strained eyes of exhaustion. She put her head slowly under his chin, nuzzling. The gurgling growl sound was his purr of approval, and one of his black wings came down over her like a wonderful midnight blanket. "Finally," he said with a tired expression as he allowed himself to relax. They rested while staring wordlessly at the remains of their enemy, shards of the matriarch of the central house of gold. "You'll still be getting me a new harp, Searanox?" Azurea snorted at him. The end.